Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Nancy Fuller, and I'm here from the office of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies. And I want to welcome the people who are joining us on the webcast. Our program today is entitled Listening Across Differences. Today's program is a part of an occasional series hosted jointly by the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies and the Smithsonian Heritage Month Steering Committee. The series features individuals doing innovative work in the fields of community outreach and heritage. Since today's program will be webcast, I have a couple of housekeeping requests. Please turn off your cell phones, although people do tell me that they don't work down here anyway. So we'll find out. We'll have question and answer at the end of the period with the people in the audience. So please be sure to use the microphones that are set up on the side, because that way the people who are listening on the webcast will be able to hear what you're saying. For today's program, I want to introduce Martha Norkunas. Martha has just joined the faculty at the Middle Tennessee State University, and she's in the Public History Department. She holds a PhD in folklore from Indiana University's Folklore Institute. She is the author of The Politics of Public Memory, Tourism, History, and Ethnicity in Monterey, California. And she also authored Monuments and Memory, History and Representation in Lowell, Massachusetts. She has worked with museums, historic sites, and nonprofits across the country on issues of memory, identity, gender, and representation of minority voices. She is also an oral historian and has been involved in a number of oral history projects on industrial and labor history, immigration, racial identity, and gender. Please welcoming me and giving a warm welcome to Dr. Norkunas.
Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank Philippa Rappaport for inviting me to come today, and I'd like to thank Nancy Fuller for her introduction and for escorting me over today. And welcome to all of you in the audience who've taken time away from your busy schedules to come, and to the folks who are joining us via webcast, either live today or it's funny to be talking to someone in the future. Anyway, welcome to all of you. As Martin Luther King Jr. said as he traveled to support the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, shortly before he was killed, the question is not, if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? The question we should be asking more and more in our world. Each institution, each program can develop a model for how to be meaningfully engaged in the community in which we live. The best way to become engaged is to go out, meet people, ask them about their lives, listen to what they say, and see how you and your organization can make a positive impact in your immediate surroundings. You will meet people you might never have met, you'll draw new audiences to your organization, and most importantly, you'll create projects and relationships that can have a lasting impact on the world you live in. If you're a teacher, bring your students with you. If you work in an organization, bring your staff or co-workers with you. It will expand your knowledge and your compassion, and it'll become a way of life. The National Park Service produced a report on its civic initiative some years ago. In that booklet, they described why they wanted to change the way they interpreted the past. They wanted to understand the past and not simply celebrate it. They wanted museums to be centers where people would meet and converse and participate in collective problem solving. They wanted the museum to be an incubator of change. The National Park also wanted to give expression to diverse voices, to diversify the national landscape of remembrance, and to reinforce visitors' understanding of the contemporary relevance of historical events. They hoped that these changes would act as springboards for personal journeys of intellectual and cultural enrichment. The national landscape of remembrance would involve thinking about issues that are both profoundly joyous and deeply sad. As John Hope Franklin said, the places that commemorate sad history are not places in which we wallow in, but instead places in which we may be moved to a new resolve to be better citizens. I think of people nationally who've gone out into communities around them. Gavin Newsom, the mayor of San Francisco, used to walk the city with a team of people from his office to see what needed to be done, to talk to people, and to generate ideas and action. Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, lives in a housing project so he can directly understand the people who most need help from the government. A team of artists, Kate Erickson and Mel Ziegler, once proposed a public art project which entailed them living in a housing project, meeting the residents regularly, and instead of the artists designing and building art in the project, they would help the residents create the art. Folklorists and anthropologists have long gone out into communities to try to understand other cultures. Community organizers and activists and charitable organizations have gone out to homes, schools, community centers, and other places where people congregate to figure out how to best help them. Identifying artisans for the Lowell Folk Festival, a huge festival not unlike your own Smithsonian Folk Festival. I found so many local people who had never presented at the festival before. When my colleagues asked me where I'd found them, I answered that I'd walked down the street. I wasn't being facetious. I'd literally walked down the street looking at the shops and small businesses with new eyes. I'd found fancy plasterers, upholsterers, stone carvers, bricklayers, wedding dressmakers, and monument designers, all artisans who'd learned their trades in traditional ways and who created beauty. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the projects I've done. In 1999, I created a project I called Interpreting the Texas Past at the University of Texas at Austin, under the auspices of the Intellectual Entrepreneurship Consortium. For 10 years, I taught graduate students how to work with community groups to develop projects that would have some social and cultural impact. Initially, we worked with historic sites and museums, looking at the kinds of interpretive exhibits they had, talking to people in the community, and trying to help the sites be more inclusive by telling the stories of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and women, and other communities that had long been silenced. My graduate students produced films, websites, brochures, walking tours, and oral histories about the people and events that were not being presented in the museums. Because I try to do projects that don't require much or any money, my students and I began to develop online exhibits for local museums and community organizations. We created 10 exhibits for the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center in Austin, a city museum that focuses on African American history. The director of the Carver, Ms. Bernadette Pfeiffer, grew to trust the quality of the work my graduate students and I produced. Her assistant, Faith Weaver, was a great help, and I'd like to mention the tireless work of city web specialist Takara McNeely-Gordon, who's putting the materials online even as I speak. When completed, the exhibits will vastly expand the museum's online offerings to the public with their in-depth explorations of very specific and compelling topics in Austin's African American history. We created exhibits about the story of Barbara Smith Conrad, the famous opera singer who was ousted from the opera Dido and Aeneas in the 1950s at the University of Texas at Austin because she was slated to play opposite a white male. Broadcasting to the East Side is an exhibit about the first African American and Hispanic radio programs in Austin and has visuals as well as audio. Let's Pretend about Ada Simon, the writer who created children's books about Black life in Austin, and the actual businesses described in her books is about to go up. We created exhibits about desegregating Austin's high schools, the controversies surrounding the renaming of 19th Street to Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, and a host of other provocative and insightful snapshots of Austin's racial past. We branched out to other museums and cultural organizations. For diverse arts, my graduate student Roger Gashett created Who's Blues, Race Relations and Segregation on the East Austin blues scene, exploring the intersections of race and music in Austin. And at the Neil Cochran House Museum, we did an online exhibit that uses the image of General George Custer and his wife Libby, along with a group of other people, to explore race and race relations in Austin just after the Civil War. For a museum in the Hill Country, we created booklets about women's lives, children's lives, work, and community based on interviews with local people, and a walking tour of African American history in Austin, at the end of which the visitor would record their own memories of the sites. For the Varner Hogg Plantation Museum, one former student, Carrie Cordova, created a project to identify the people who had once been enslaved there. At the same site, one of my graduate students did oral histories with many local people to tell the story from a very different perspective. One day, an African-American visitor told the site director that his daughters wanted to stop and visit the museum, but he said no, he did not want to hear the same old story of the grand days of the plantation. When his young daughters insisted, he took them in and sat down to watch the orientation film, Impressions in Fire and Clay. It was a film my graduate student Tony Cherian had produced for the site, telling the stories of African Americans who'd been associated with the plantation for more than 100 years. The visitor said he cried, telling the director that he could not believe a Texas plantation museum would include a film about African Americans, narrated by African Americans. One other project I'd like to mention is the Austin Women's Commemorative Project. We asked, how could we preserve the memory of local women who were involved in social change or in activities of significance to their communities? We asked people what a city would look like if it was made by and for women. Here's a visual representation of one suggestion, a photoshopped image of all the street signs in the city being renamed for women. And Jane Y. McCallum was a Texas suffragist, and people in Texas, when I show this slide, usually gasp because it's such a great idea to rename one of the major city streets with Jane Y. McCallum. Over time, I broadened the project to include not just historic sites and museums, but other kinds of organizations. I was impressed with a project my friend and colleague Susie Seraph had done with a health clinic, creating a small exhibit about the clients in the waiting room. The exhibit was very successful, and I thought about how much museums have to struggle to bring people in. Instead, I thought about bringing interpretive projects to other institutions. I approached the People's Community Clinic in Austin, Texas, and asked them if my graduate seminar, Cultural Representations of the Past, could work with them. We wanted to see how we could use cultural knowledge to address social issues. They were very interested. We met with the staff, and they talked to us about their clients and the kind of health challenges they faced. They had a diverse population, with a large majority from Mexico. Over the course of the semester, 2 of my students developed a model culturally sensitive cookbook for diabetic Mexican Americans. They worked with the dietitian, identifying foods recommended for diabetics, and then went to clients' homes and asked them how they could incorporate food for diabetics into traditional recipes. And this is an image from the cookbook of the prototype that they presented based on interviews with the clients, going to their houses and videotaping them making recipes and doing some research about traditional foods. I encourage my students to talk to people from various communities and to develop their projects in cooperation with a community-based organization. I want them to learn not only the substantive issues associated with their projects, but a model of how to go out and meet people, talk to them, negotiate with them, and to create a project that will be of benefit to them. It strikes me that most of us don't know much about what people in other American subcultures experience, what they think, or what matters to them and why. Yet many of us hunger for direct, meaningful engagement with people. I've often been the only European American person in a room, or the only woman, or the only one who is clearly different from everyone else. Sometimes I know one person from the group I'm with, one person who's my cultural guide. I come to know this person because I made a special effort to do so, and they become my connection to the larger community. Here are some practical steps to doing outreach. When I go to a new place, or even when I'm in an old place, I try to have coffee with someone new every 2 weeks. I find that person by referrals, by contacting the local historical association, by asking people who's doing interesting things in the community, in art or history or anything else. It takes courage to call someone you don't know and ask them if they'd like to meet for coffee, so I always give myself a little reward when I do it, maybe some chocolate or some ice cream. I'll tell them I heard about them from this person or this article. I'm interested in their work or in meeting them. Almost 100% of the people I've called have agreed to see me. When I meet with them, I ask them about their lives, their work, what's important to them. I look for places where we can connect professionally. Sometimes I describe a project to the person and ask if they'd be interested in working with me on it at some point. Sometimes we just talk. Later, when someone says, "Do you know anyone who—" I do know someone because I had coffee with them 2 months ago or a year ago. Although it seems to be an old-fashioned term, I believe in the importance of visiting. Personal visits are of great importance. I try to go to the person's place of business just to say a quick hello and introduce myself. Try to go out of your comfort zone when you set about meeting new people. Network and build relationships with diverse audiences. For example, when I was the Cultural Affairs Director at the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission in Massachusetts, I realized that it would be helpful to get to know people from the Cambodian community, as 25,000 Cambodians had resettled in the city. I went to the Cambodian New Year celebration every year. I was usually the only non-Cambodian there. I also went to see the monks to explain to them who I was and ask how I might best help the community. I initially extended my hand to shake the monk's hand and then realized very quickly that the monks don't touch women. And so, but he was very gracious. The monk himself was used to meeting, people from the States. I went to the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association and talked to the director and staff. I went to any Cambodian events I heard about. I began to see people who I'd met before, and I began to feel more comfortable. I told people that I wanted to help them develop projects, and I was in the terrific position of administering a grant program for the city. The first project I did was to assist some community members in developing funding for a Cambodian language television program. I was invited to the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association board meeting, where again I was the only non-Cambodian. As I was the guest, I was served first, but I had no idea how to politely eat. Everyone was waiting for me, so I leaned over and told my cultural guide, Jean Vibaltip, that I did not know what to do. He smiled, helped me to serve myself, and everyone began eating and talking. People began to know that I was a friend of the community, and we did many more projects together. Even years later, when I went back to visit Lowell, someone from the community came up to me and shook my hand, thanking me for what I'd done. Build relationships. Invite people to your events and go to theirs. If you can involve them in something that would help them, do it. People have to know you'll be there over time. They have to be able to count on you. They must learn to trust you. As a German cultural theorist, Walter Benjamin once wrote, "Anyone can study, but learning is something you can only do if you are there for the duration." Anyone can go to a meeting or be introduced, but networking and relationship building is something you can only do if you're there for the duration. Here's an image of the Martin Luther King Jr. rally in Austin, and I always go because I believe in it and because I want to see people and I want them to see me there. And it was at the Lost rally in 2009 that I met Nelson Linder, who heads the Austin chapter of the NAACP and who had been one of the narrators that my graduate students had interviewed. I did my first oral history interview with an African-American woman in 1995 in Palestine, Texas. I never forgot the 6 hours I spent with Dorothy Robinson or the stories she told me. It was the first time I'd heard someone I knew tell me about her grandmother being sold.
Her mother called her to the door when an Irish physician, Dr. Bright, was driving away from the house in a handsome buggy drawn by 2 matching horses. And her mother told her, "You see that man? That is your father." And don't forget that he's one of the best doctors in all Norfolk. Well, it so happened that my grandmother's owners were Groomsteads, and Dr. Bright was a friend of the Groomsteads. And he come to visit the Groomstead and went to bed with a slave woman. And my grandmother was the product of that association. So when she was sold at the age of 8, her mother told her to come and kiss your little brother goodbye. She went to, I don't know whether the little brother was Dr. Bright's child or not. But anyway, she kissed the brother goodbye, and she never saw her mother or her brother, nor her mother anymore. Then the Davises that bought her from the Groomsteads sold her to a Mr. Hall. And Mr. Hall brought her to Texas from Virginia. And they must have come down to Mississippi because she says she remembers the band playing and the people singing.
This is your father's mother?
My father's mother.
Okay.
Jeff Davis is our president, and Lincoln is a fool. Jeff Davis rides a big white horse, and Lincoln rides a mule. She remembered that. And then after she came to Texas, and I don't know how old she was then, but at the age of 16, she was...
At the age of 16, she was freed. Many years later, in 2004, a colleague at the University of Texas at Austin asked me if I'd direct my students in my graduate seminar in oral history to interview African Americans on the occasion of the anniversaries of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. As my students in the Interpreting the Texas Past project had done a fair amount of work reinterpreting African American history for historic sites in Texas, I knew something about the Texas Black community, and I remembered the power of Miss Robinson's words. But I did not know many people of African descent in Austin. Initially, friends gave me the names of people they knew who might consent to be interviewed. Many were people in public positions, the director of the Texas NAACP and the director of the Austin chapter of the NAACP, the editor of an African American newspaper in Austin, and the editor of a progressive newspaper, the first black female Secretary of State, a judge, civil rights activists, and other locally well-known people, well known for sure in the black community and in political circles. The first year I had 14 students of diverse backgrounds doing the interviews, whose parents or grandparents came from Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Nicaragua, India, or who were themselves of African descent. Many of my students were of European descent, and for many of them, it was the first time they had ever spent 2 hours in a room listening to someone who was African American. In this way, the process of doing the project became as important as the oral history products we were producing. The stories were so beautifully narrated, so historically significant, that I decided to continue the project and to call it the African American Texans Oral History Project. For the next 6 years, I taught the course every spring. My students engaged with 100 narrators, creating over 400 hours of audio and video testimony. I've read more than 5,000 pages of life histories and feel that I have seen another world and been transformed by it. I spend much of my uncommitted time processing the interviews and have benefited from the volunteer efforts of many of my former graduate students who spend countless hours just volunteering to help me process these so we can get them all online. All of the oral histories will soon be available via a database and website we call historymemoryculture.org. At the end of the first year, when I read a transcript that I was particularly moved by, I called the narrator and asked if I could meet with him or her. Clint Smith became my friend and colleague in 2004 when I met him at a reception I organized for the narrators at the University of Texas. That same year, I listened to the oral history of Akwesi Evans, the editor of NACOA, a progressive newspaper in Austin. In this excerpt, he tells the story of being suspended from high school when he and a young woman who accused him of wanting to take over exchanged words. I'll give you a little preview. She calls him the N-word and he calls her the B-word. He's suspended from school, but nothing happens to her. This is one of the only audios that's has a little bit of ambient noise, as they say?
I got suspended several times at the White House. I got suspended the following year. As I told you, I was the only African American in the speech club. After about 3 speech meets, I asked the teacher if I could participate. And she finally let me go participate in a speech meet in Santa Ana, Kentucky. I did extemporaneous speaking. I was in 2 different meets. I placed a very good 4 points in each meet for a total of 8 points. If I had been allowed to be in a second speech meet and only got a fair, I would have been a thespian. So I asked the teacher if I could go to another speech meet so I could join the thespian club. A young lady rose up from a young blonde-haired girl rose up from the back of the room and said the N-word. Said, "We let you in the speech club, you want to take over every damn thing?" And I got up and said the B word. I said, "I want every damn opportunity you get." Principal called me to his office, said, "You're suspended." He said, "It's inexcusable to use the B word in this school." I said, "What about the N word?" He said, "That's different."
She wasn't punished?
No, of course not. The N word was okay. The B word wasn't. And so that was my initiation to the civil rights movement, where I've spent my entire life
Ever since. He spent his entire life in the civil rights movement ever since that time. I was so impressed with his life story that I invited him to have dinner at our house. He'd never met me, and I had to explain that I was the director of the Oral History Project and was so moved by his interview that I hoped he'd come and have dinner with my family and some colleagues. I invited people who had been active in the anti-death penalty movement, as I knew that Akwesi had been very involved with anti-death penalty activities. He came with a friend. There were 8 of us at dinner. The talk was interesting and engaging. Later, Akwesi wrote an editorial about having dinner in the home of a white woman of privilege. I come from a working-class family and grew up with a single working mother, so I never think of myself that way, and I emailed him a long response. He answered, and we began a correspondence in which we exchanged ideas and debated issues of race and privilege. I told him I'd help him, and he should ask me for help if he needed it. Several years later, he wrote and asked if I would help him raise money for the newspaper, as it was in slender circumstances. Together with Clint Smith and Doug Reber of the Green Party, we held an event and raised $2,000. When I was leaving Austin to come to the public history program at Middle Tennessee State University, my friends threw a going-away party for me. Akwesi came. People talked about how they'd known me. Akwesi told the people at the party that when I invited him to dinner, it was the first time in his life he'd been in the home of a person of European descent as a guest. I was stunned, but then I realized it was one of the first times someone of African descent had come to dinner in my home. Over the years, I went to see other narrators. Willis Littlefield is a gospel singer in the group The Bells of Joy, and he's well known in the music world. I read his oral history, and afterwards I was so impressed with the kind of eloquence of his reflections on segregation and the deep-seated optimism he had that I went to a store, bought a chocolate cake, and drove to his house. He and his wife were at home, sitting on the porch, and after I explained who I was, they just showed up with a chocolate cake. They'd never met me. They pulled up a chair, and we sat down on the front porch and visited for an hour. And I'm going to play a short excerpt that, which is one of the reasons that I was so drawn to him. And in this short excerpt, he talks about in his neighborhood, which he's lived in for many years. It used to be an historically black neighborhood, but has been, quote-unquote, gentrified. He talks about sitting in a restaurant, having been invited to the opening, and looking out from the window at places that he was once not even allowed to enter. But the wonderful thing is he starts laughing about it.
When I was coming up, that if people had these restaurants and stuff like that, you weren't allowed to go and sit in those places like that. This place is right down here now. This drugstore around right now, I seen the time I couldn't even go in that place to sit out. And they didn't have tables and chairs, just had the bar. You stand, order stuff, and come on out of there. This house park barbecue down here up under the hill. You couldn't go into the front, you go around to the back. They have a table for you to sit down in the back there. Like Woolworks used to be right on 6th and Congress, and white pharmacies across opposite over there. Couldn't go in those places and sit down and order you nothing to eat. Or something they might give you a cup of water or something like that, you know. But you wasn't allowed to do all that. We were even coming up. We wasn't allowed. I tell you, Clarksville didn't have no school bus. We catch the city bus. And what we spend, the city would give our money back at the end of the week or end of the month. They give it back to your parents and stuff like that when you caught those buses. And you couldn't even, you get on that bus, you go to the back of that bus. Stuff like that, you know, we went through all that kind of stuff. We come out of that stuff when Johnson became president, you know. She passed that bill, I think in 1964. You know, all that stuff was done away with, stuff like that. Yeah. I was looking at, did I tell you this? Me and my wife went to this place right here on the corner. It's Nukazola. Okay. We went there when it first opened up, and they invited everybody to come there. And before all that opened up, after I came grown and used to work here and there, it used to be a service station right where Cazolo's. There used to be a service station, years, a bus service station. I would go there. I used to work in there part-time at this service station. And during the time I put the mobile home back here, I would go there, and because it closed up like 9 o'clock, something like that. I would go and I would work at that service station there. Then that service station left, it came to be something like a Dunkin' Donuts. Then from Dunkin' Donuts, it came to be a little old nightclub was there. And after that, I think it came to be Domino Pizza. Then after that, it came to be the vegetarian place. Came vegetarian place twice. Then it came to be what it is now. So my wife and I went to the grand opening, and we were sitting right at the corner there. And I just went to laughing. And she said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "You know, life is funny." She said, "What you laughing about?" I said, "You see where I'm sitting here? I used to work here. It used to be a service station here I worked at. I said, now I'm sitting right on top of all of this. I said, I'm looking right across the street at Niles Drugstore, looking at a place where I used to couldn't even go." Used to even couldn't go in there and eat. I said, ain't this amazing? I'm sitting down in this place where I used to work and looking right across the streets. I said, I done come a long way. The Lord done brought us a long way. I said, that's strange, ain't it? I said, this is amazing. And it is amazing. It is. Man, I think she thought I was going crazy. You ever just thought, just sit there and just being by yourself, and something just come up, you just laugh at it, you know, sometimes?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, she thought I was going crazy. I said, nah, man, I can't believe this. Sat here eating at the place where I used to work, looking at the place, couldn't even go and eat.
And he just ends it, he says, Lord, we done come a long way. I saw him at another event of another narrator, Harold McMillan, who's to your right. the director of Diverse Arts, for whom we produced an exhibit. I was helping Mr. McMillan to interview blues musicians about how gentrification had changed music in East Austin, once the African-American neighborhood in the city. Mr. Littlefield, and that's him on the left, greeted me warmly because I'd taken the time to go and visit him. And also because I'd taken the time to go and visit them and met his wife. The following year, one of my graduate students began to interview Mr. Littlefield's wife and did 4 hours of oral history interviews with her, and they formed a bond. Later, I met Eleanor Thompson, a remarkable woman who's active in politics and well-known in Democratic circles. Once again, I was drawn to her after reading her oral history. Here she explains her grandmother's refusal to get off the sidewalk when white people passed. And she tells the story how her father would always step down off the sidewalk if anybody white passed, and she thought it was a game. But her grandmother would never do it.
My kind of understanding of some differences came about with my grandmother, Martha Ann. I would go to town with her. She was ill. I must have been like 5 or 6, no, a little older than that, maybe 7 or 8. But I would go to town with her, and when we went to town with her, she was so proud. She sat in front of the bus. We always kind of sat middle ways by this time I came along, back. She didn't do that. She sat right behind the bus driver. She was very prim and proper. She wore a pearl. She had a little hat on. And because I had to go with her, I'd sit up there beside her too. With my dad, it was different. If we rode the bus.
Did anybody ever say anything to her?
Nobody ever said anything to her. It's really interesting. Dad, we'd always get the back. Sometimes when I go with my dad was, and this is the truth, I was about 4 or 5 when I can remember this vividly happening, and something was different. He would walk down the sidewalk on Congress, and he would get off the sidewalk if he met white people coming. Black men had to do this. You just couldn't. It was almost like confrontational. If you just stayed up there. So it was better if you just stepped off into the street. And so my dad would step off, and I thought it was a game, so I hopped off. And so then he would step back up, I'd hop back up. And we would do that. And I didn't. And finally, with my grandmother, I was walking with her down Congress, and it hit me. She doesn't get off, because I was about to. I saw these people coming, and I was done. It was like, she doesn't. This is different. What does she do? And I watched her, and she just went right on. Thought something's different here. Then, probably the same time, we went in J.C. Penney's. And when I was young, J.C. Penney's had 2 fountains in there, a black fountain and a white fountain. And I went over to go drink water out of the black fountain, and she walked over, wouldn't let me. She caught my head, and she said, "We don't drink water down here." And I was like, I drink water out here with my mother. When I come down with my mother, I didn't understand. But she didn't allow that. She said she was a Yankee. She was different. Her people, her father, Reuben Hancock, had come from Virginia. They were Yankees. And so my grandmother said, I heard her say this. And she would say this, I'm a Yankee. That's what she would say. And she was very proud and did not take anything off of anybody. So I noticed there's something different with this. That was my first recollection.
It was a bit of a different definition of Yankee coming from Virginia, but it's an amazing story. Oral history is a particularly intense way to connect with another person, and managing a large oral history project connected me with many people I immediately admired and wanted to know. I can't tell you how many times I would read the oral histories, and I would sit in my room, and sometimes I would cry, and sometimes I would just think, this is an amazing person, this is an amazing response to a set of historical circumstances, or an amazing reaction to institutionalized racism. It was really a remarkable experience. When I first moved to Austin, I met Karen Riles, who later became the African American liaison for the Austin History Center. She seemed to know everything about African American history in Austin and was willing to share her knowledge without hesitation. Over the years, we worked together more and more, and slowly we became friends. When she wrote and told me she was moving to Atlanta last year, I responded that I did not think I could do my projects without her. Her return email surprised me. She said that I had inspired her to strive for excellence in her work and made her see that her work in African American history was important. I knew she'd help me, but I'd never known I'd inspired her. We built a bond, and that bond resulted in many thoughtful projects about local African American history. She's also a remarkable storyteller. Here she tells the story of moving from Arizona to Texas and realizing for the first time that there's racism based on the color of one's skin?
Because it was just like, it came as a total shock to me. It was a total shock. I just did not understand, because all I knew from being very young was that we always played with the little white boy and girl that lived in our neighborhood, the Mexican families that they were on the block, some of the white families that were further away, blocks away. We always hung out together, never had a negative experience. I just couldn't fathom that this whole world existed that I didn't know about. It was.
She said it was just amazing. I don't know why it's clipping the end of it. She said it was just amazing to her. Take the time to go out and see people. Show them that their words matter and that you value them. Extend a hand of friendship. Even in our digital age, people respond to personal connections. I respected the people I met through the Oral History Project and tried to help them in whatever ways I could. They seemed to respect me and helped me tremendously by contributing their oral histories and by accepting me as a colleague and sometimes a friend. It became important to me not just to talk about diversity in my work, but to make a personal commitment to it. I wanted to reach over racial and ethnic barriers, not only as a colleague, but as a friend. Relationships with people who are different from you do not happen naturally in our world, or they do not often happen naturally. I actively worked to create situations where I could meet people who were different from me, particularly African Americans in the last years. I imagined dinner parties in which people would invite people of very diverse backgrounds to sit and talk, as we talked with Equasi at our house. They'd invite the same group each month for 6 months. At the end of the time, perhaps friendships would form, or at the least, professional connections. I imagined 7 or 8 friends would have the dinner parties, and then 7 or 8 of those people would host them. People would listen to each other in an atmosphere of openness. As I continued with the African American Oral History Project in Texas, and as I continue with it today in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, I think more and more about what it means to listen to another person, especially to someone who comes from a background that's different racially or ethnically or sexually or in terms of class or geography or the many other kinds of difference that define our identity. I developed exercises for my graduate students on nuanced listening in which they experimented with hearing more than words. What does it mean to listen? What makes a good listener? How can one listen empathetically while still recognizing the unique identity of the other person? In our moment in time when we've become compulsive multitaskers, constantly checking the many ways people have to communicate with us, do we ever engage in focused listening? I often ask people in my oral history workshops, when's the last time anyone listened to you with absolute focus for 2 hours? How can we ask questions about difficult issues in a way that is respectful, and in the case of our project, racially sensitive? I also think about how the African American Oral History Project has changed me personally. From listening to the 100 narrators my students interviewed, sometimes literally listening to the audio from their interview, and sometimes by reading their transcripts, I feel that I've had a rare opportunity to see behind the veil, as W.E.B. Du Bois so famously described the double consciousness of African Americans. I will never embody the experience of being black in America, but now I know something about the 1,000 different ways racism manifests itself in this country, and about the ways in which families have confronted racism and segregation, endured and maintained a sense of identity and integrity. Inspired by the African American Oral History Project, I decided to ask undergraduates to interview each other about their racial and ethnic identities, as I thought that race and ethnicity were among the most important factors in shaping one's identity. Identity among 21-year-olds turns out to be more complex and more nuanced. We learned that sexuality was sometimes what defined a young man, or religion, or a close-knit family, or the struggles of poverty, or the intervention of a single caring adult. My students read excerpts from their interviews, which provoked such interesting audience discussion that we performed for Diversity Week at the University of Texas and at a local high school that's experiencing racial tension. None of this happened on its own. I was the one who did the outreach and arranged all of the performances. For some time, I thought about what it would mean to introduce students from racially different high schools, to bring them together and have them listen to each other. I realized that they were absolutely equal in their stories, and they could begin to build understanding if they shared their stories. Hopefully, this process would help to ease racial tensions in schools or between schools. I met Anne Graham, a woman who organizes cultural projects at a conference for community organizations. I invited her to have coffee, of course, and talked to her about my idea. She told me there was a school in Texas where an honors school was housed in a mainstream school. The honors school was predominantly Anglo-American with some Asian students and small numbers of Hispanics and African Americans. The mainstream school was about 40% African American and 40% Hispanic. There was a good deal of tension between the two schools. We decided to launch the project at that school and to begin with the teachers. We hoped the faculty from the two schools, themselves from very different backgrounds, could begin to understand each other better and form professional relationships. We met with the two principals and explained what we wanted to do. They were enthusiastic. We enlisted parent volunteers to help us. Anne was my cultural liaison to the schools. She knew everyone. Then we made a pitch to the teachers. We told them we wanted to create pairs of teachers to interview each other. They would begin with a 3-hour oral history training session that I'd conduct. There'd be 2 additional interviews, followed by group discussions about the stories they were hearing and what it meant to listen across difference. Right away, a number of teachers from the honors program signed up to participate. No one signed up from the mainstream school. I was neither surprised nor concerned. Here's an important lesson in community building. You can't put a sign on your door and expect people to come to you. You have to go out and bring them in. So I went to the school several times during their lunch hour. I went from room to room, introduced myself, and asked teachers from the mainstream school if they'd participate in my oral history project, and I personalized it on purpose. And I asked them who else they thought might be interested. Then I went to the people they recommended and talked to them about the project, why it mattered, and why I thought they would benefit from it. After 2 days, I had 7 pairs of teachers from the 2 different faculties who were committed to participating. I intuitively created pairs, a 50-something Anglo-American woman with a 28-year-old African-American man, a 40-year-old Jewish man with a 40-year-old African-American man, 2 women in their 30s, from what they thought were very different backgrounds, and a 28-year-old European-American woman with a 45-year-old African-American man, and so on. People who were so different in terms of race, gender, age, and life experience found common ground in listening to each other tell about pivotal life experiences. We met twice more, and each time the pairs conducted interviews, first about their childhood and teenage years, and then about their 20s and adulthood. At our last meeting, participants read meaningful passages from the narrator's oral history. The stories were so moving that by the end of the performance, the audience was in tears. The 2 women in their 30s read about their relationships with their grandmothers and brothers and how they'd come to treasure that relative when they thought they might lose them. A male-female pair found common bond in tragedy they'd undergone. When Dawn read Alicia's passage about almost losing her daughter to anorexia, the audience barely breathed. A young African-American man listened to a 50-year-old European-American woman talk about living in Africa and escaping from a revolution. Another pair of teachers created an atmosphere of trust in their interviews. She told them about a painful experience in her past in which she and her sister were forbidden from dating young men of color. In the presence of his empathetic listening, her story emerged in a way that seemed healing to me. He was able to tell her of key experiences in his life growing up on the south side of Chicago. Several of the teachers told me they were transformed by the project. What emerged was a protected space and time in which 2 people could tell each other what was important to them in their lives. And as the goal of the project was not to produce a permanent archive of the oral histories, but to create trust and respect and the beginning of a positive working relationship, the teachers were free to talk openly about themselves. And they did that. They spoke openly in this trusted environment. And I know it's sort of anti-archival, especially since I myself am now being recorded. But we had no intention of preserving these oral histories in any archive. And that's been a new experience for me in the process to create a project that is not meant to be archived, but is meant to create trust and bonds in a secure and open space. I wrote to every single person, by the way, to ask if I could show their image and even refer to them in this presentation, and got their permission to do so. You can listen empathetically, and you create situations for others to do so through your intervention in communities, in this instance, high schools experiencing racial tension. You can create models for listening and building partnerships. The last slide is one I love. It's Ernestine Thompson, an activist and museum director at my going away party. Here she is with one of my graduate students, Lori Dong, whose parents came to the United States from China. And Ms. Thompson is asking Lori Dong to volunteer for her. I invited Ernestine Thompson to my party. She didn't feel that well, but she said that she needed help with some of her museum projects. And I said a number of graduate students would be there, and she might get some volunteers. And she said, okay, I'll come. So I told my graduate students that I think might help her about it. And then as they were all leaving, standing at the door, and I was kissing Ernestine Thompson goodbye, I looked over at my graduate students' faces, and they both just smiled and nodded, so I knew that they'd committed to helping her. Perhaps a friendship will develop between them. At the very least, they're open to each other, caring. I'm committed to doing projects that are broadly concerned with several large themes, and I've made a decision to try really to commit myself to projects that I think are as meaningful as I can imagine them. Really, I think if we could abolish war or decrease violence in our world, it would be an amazing thing. Developing a caring relationship with the environment and helping people who are very different talk to each other and appreciate each other's humanity. I like to identify sites of consciousness and conscience in local communities where people can reflect on what those places meant and mean today. I'd like to document the lives of peace activists in order to strengthen their work and bring news of it to larger audiences. I'd like to ask people what matters to them and why, and to build on issues that strengthen caring relationships between people from diverse groups and between people and the earth. Thank you. Sure, if anybody has any questions. And I personally would love to hear about your work and some of the projects that you've been involved with in building relationships with diverse audiences. They did ask if you wouldn't mind if you could go to the mics again, just because this is being recorded.
Hi, thank you very much for that. It was very inspirational, but something that I was wondering you could discuss a little bit more. Did you encounter any difficult issues, or did any encounters end in a way that perhaps was not as inspirational? Or
we encounter difficult issues constantly.
Can you discuss how you handled those?
Yeah. Well, one woman said to one of my graduate students, I want to write this book. What are you doing here? You're going to write my story. You're a young white man at the university, and you'll benefit from it. Then you'll go home. And what will I get? And what he said to her was, and I hope this is true, he said, I don't keep the copyright to your story. It's yours. You keep all rights to your story. I give you all the audio. I give you the transcripts. And you have the right to say it goes on the web or not goes on the web, and you can write your own book, and I hope I've just helped you further it along. And so it becomes a kind of mutual engagement in the process. What I have found is, I'm obviously a white woman doing these projects in African American history, and I asked my African American friends and colleagues about that. And since I've moved to Murfreesboro, I had I've made an effort, of course, to visit with my African American colleagues, and one man really impressed me. And I said to him, should I be, I know what I am and I know what I'm not. And he said, when you gave the job talk here, the other African American faculty and I wanted you to come because we understood that you saw something, that you got it. And he said, and that you're committed to social justice issues. So there's often, I don't know if that's exactly what you had in mind. The other kinds of issues that we encounter are tremendous violence in people's lives, sexual exploitation. These are all unexpected because we think the interview is about someone's life history and we're not sure that these kinds of very emotionally charged issues are going to come up. But then we come back together as a group and we talk about, we're not therapists, how can we most sensitively handle these issues that have come up in the oral history process. We're creating a social history document. And some of the people one woman explicitly said, I was molested as a young woman, and I'm telling the story on purpose because I've now become very successful. And I want other women to know that they can overcome this. So those were some of with younger people, the 21-year-olds, if those interviews, if I ever decide, they all released them, but if I ever decide to put them on the web, I believe that I would do them all anonymously to protect the students from perhaps having revealed more than they had intended to. What else?
Hi. I also really found your stories and projects very inspirational. I'm a program curator with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and we've done a number of oral histories over the years. And one thing that I've encountered several times is that sometimes people will tell me what they think I want to hear, particularly if I'm asking sort of historical questions about racism. Have you encountered that, and how do you deal with that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it comes up constantly, and I guess it's just we just try to spend more time with the narrator. So the first interview, as you well know, is a kind of overview, and then when they go back the second time, and in fact, this was kind of interesting. This one woman said, well, there was, everything was fine. There was no racial discrimination. And then she said, well, was everyone around you African American? She goes, oh, yeah. Yeah, we lived on our side of the street, and they lived on their side of the street. We got along just fine. And so then she just spent a little time with her. And actually, it was this young woman, Lori Dong. She said, may I ask you could I ask, push that a little bit? Can I spend some time on that? And her narrator said, yes. And she said, don't you think that is the effect of racism in America, that you lived on different sides of the street? And she the two of them together had this really very, very tender and revealing moments at the end of the interview where they tried to explore it together. And so the people who haven't been well interviewed tend to be, of course, as you also know, more open. And the more polished public figures, although very thoughtful and interesting, give you the more polished, often told stories. I don't know, maybe because the students are so earnest in some ways. I'm not sure. And also maybe I don't know what it is they're telling me that they think I want to hear and what's very earnest. Maybe even I can't tell that. But it's a really good question. Anybody else? Really, I'd love to hear what you do if anybody just wants to stand up and tell us something about a project that you've worked in. Anyone?
I'm actually wondering about in your body of work that you've done, the interactions, these racial interactions between African Americans and Mexican Americans or Latinos, do you have some in your collection of work that I might be able to look into at some point?
You know, it only happened if my student was, I have had some students that were Mexican American, and in those cases, that interviewed African American narrators, and in those cases, they were involved in the school system together, and it became almost a class issue that many of their students had economic challenges, and so that they were thinking together about some of those issues. In the high school that we worked in, there was a lot of tension between Spanish-speaking students, mostly Mexican-American, and the African-American students. And had I not moved out of Austin, our next step would have been to have the students, not necessarily Anglo-American and African-American, but Spanish-speaking students and African-American students form narrating pairs to try to come to some kind of understanding. But I do not have a lot of examples with those interactions, but I know certainly in Texas, it's a flashpoint for a lot of tension in the schools. Anyone else?
You talked a little bit about working with, I don't know what you use the term, cultural liaisons, or someone that's a mediator between yourself and the community who is maybe a member of the community, but also has a foot in your world, so that you have this. My colleague Diana and Jai and I have worked a lot with what we call community scholars, who are often the people that do have a foot in both worlds, maybe as a graduate student or as someone who has worked on another project. Could you talk a little bit about the difficulty? Did you have any difficulty in that situation? Because I know sometimes that in our work that has put people in a difficult situation between the two worlds and a bit of tension. So I wondered if you ran into that ever, and if you could talk about that in your work.
More I ran into it when, if my cultural liaison was connected to a particular segment of the community, and then when people knew I was associated with him or her, then other people from whatever the other factions weren't as open, because they thought, oh, she's hangs with so-and-so, or she's, I don't know if it's been an issue for the liaison, him or herself. In the projects that I've worked on, I don't know. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I think they were less maybe politically sensitive than some of the other projects my colleagues have been involved with. So I don't know if the liaisons have encountered difficulties back in their own community when they were sponsoring me, if you will. But I could see that could be a difficult situation for some of them.
In your work, have you experienced tensions and differences between African Americans, economic differences or cultural differences that might have served both the narratives and about your work, and also a lot of the most recent discussion here about looking at diversity within communities or a population that's often looked at as homogeneous. And I was wondering, did you have, had you spoken to the African American graduate students within the group, and did they also, in the beginning of the project, talk about their own narratives and their own approaches to the work?
Were there any? What were the reflexive kinds of responses that you heard?
Yeah, that's another brilliant question. I was concerned at some points about directing a young, I had African American men and women in the seminars over time, and I thought, I was worried at first that who was I to direct them to interview someone when race was an important component of the narrative exchange between the narrator and the interviewer. We talked about that within the classroom, and these are all very talented young graduate students, and we realized that the project was about narrating across difference, and what emerged was sometimes enormous political differences between my student and the narrator, although they shared a racial background, or sexual differences or geographical differences, etc. And in terms of they did talk about, my African American students did talk about a certain comfort level, which the students, in drawing out the narrators, which the students of European American backgrounds did not share. Many of the students who would identify as white were very hesitant to ask about racially sensitive issues. And so there was a certain ease in the narratives when the narrator and the student and interviewer were black. But in terms of what was interesting to me in terms of the product that they produced, I was very, not surprised, but the increased racial rapport didn't produce a more thoughtful or in-depth or deeper narrative. And I had thought that there would be a significant difference between the interviews conducted by my African American students with other African Americans. I have a very small sample. It's not like I have thousands of, so we really shared their experiences, and I tried not to single them out as, well, you're the one African American or the 3 African Americans in a class of 8 or 10, to carry the weight of race. Instead, we talked more about the notion of interviewing across difference, whatever that difference might be. So I guess I would say that we didn't push the reflexivity in terms of race within the classroom from that perspective. It'd be great to bring them back and to ask them, some years later, if more about their experience in doing the interviews, and to get some self-reflexive analysis now would be a really interesting thing to do. Okay.
Thank you, Martha.
And thanks everyone for coming. If for any reason you want to get in touch with me, you can just find me at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm in the history department, so feel free to email me or stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you for being such a great audience.